Hello, Reem.
Hi, Celia. How are you?
Very good. Looking forward to this conversation.
Me too, very much so.
And I think I can speak so many different topics. We are so similar in many ways. I mean, it can even show which are similar.
We're very similar. And I can feel that we will have so much in common to speak about.
And perhaps also some differences.
Sure.
My first question that I would like to explore with you is, do you feel yourself a feminist?
Such a difficult question. I think I am, but then again, as with identity, everyone has a different conception of what feminism means. So I think feminism for me may mean something different from what it is for you, because my own culture and my own background and even the challenges that I have may be a little bit different. So feminism, I definitely believe in feminism, and I also believe in equality for everyone. But I'm sure that we'll have differences in the way that we look at it.
I think I changed quite a lot about my perception of feminism. If for me, feminism is to understand the inequalities of woman and man, then definitely I'm a feminist.
Sure.
But there is truth, like lately, there is such a different ways of understanding this inequality and the role of woman and what woman is in the first place, that I think I'm struggling with that. I believe that theoretically, every position has a room, and I can even understand all of them, even the more different ones. But in terms of action or activism, then I will have great difficulties. But I am an academic, so I don't have that much trouble for that. So I can accept all the different theories. Although I'm not sure if I was a politician or an activist, how will I do? I don't know about you.
That's a very good question as well. When you're talking now, I'm thinking about my own perception. And I think that, there shouldn't be a competition between men and women. They should be living together in general in harmony, because when humans live together in harmony, life is much easier for everyone. And once they start to be at conflict with each other, things do not necessarily work. However, if I were a politician, I think I would make sure that women have the same chances at work that men do, but also make their life a bit easier in terms of family. Because a woman is challenged with struggling to keep her family, bring up her kids, and also work. And it's only fair that work should give her some more release time, more compensation, making sure that this does not affect her career. So I would actually work in making sure that there's equity between both in terms of, work-wise, in terms of salary, which is a very big issue all over the world, actually, whether women are, in terms of salary, they are paid less than men. In terms of leadership positions, I would very much want to see more women in leadership positions. But in terms of, on human aspect, it's a very good idea not to look at feminism as there is it's aggression towards men or there's competition between men and women. I think it's much more about living together with equity, as you mentioned, and with equal power and cooperating together to make life easier for everyone.
And I think it's richer because reality is a puzzle. So I think every single angle, how odd it is at first, it contributes to understand reality a little better. For instance, with the feminism of difference, I like all these ideas of the femininity and the values all the feminine can bring into society. And even with the new modes of feminism, these kind of post-structuralist or postmodern ideas of the non-binary and the social construct of society, to me it's difficult because it's a whole different generation, but I think it adds a little bit into the puzzle of reality. However, I think sometimes it's difficult to understand these new generations. So I don't know, how do you see the youth in Egypt? How is the woman movement in Egypt?
I'm not very familiar with the woman movement in Egypt specifically, but I'm just looking at myself and my own values. And I feel like if we want to have equality, which is the most important thing we really want to have, we would need the help of both men and women. We need the help of mothers who are bringing up their kids. I'm just thinking, how do you bring up a man to respect a woman, to respect her career, respect her achievements, realize that she also needs to realize herself and achieve success in her own way and not just as an asset to a man. And I think these are kind of challenges that I feel in Egypt specifically are very important. And they should be taught at a young age for both men and women. You know, it should be like parents are teaching their kids, family members are teaching their kids, schools and universities are teaching students that this is a very essential part of life. And you know, when women and men are both producing, then we will end up with a society that is way better and economically and politically and culturally.
Totally agree. I don't know if you understand. To me, it was very difficult to understand. Probably not so much now, but in the late 90s, when I saw many young women putting back the veil as a sign of feminism.
Sure.
How can you understand that? Because here, at least for some people, it was very difficult to understand how this can be considered a feminism.
So basically, in my opinion, the idea is that women should be free. Their body is their body. They want to cover it, they should be free. They don't want to cover it all, that's also up to them. So the idea is that throughout history, women all over the world, unfortunately, were always used as a symbol. They are always symbolized. They are always sort of idealized, and lots of restrictions are put on them because of that. So because you're a symbol of the country, you should not put the veil, or because you're the symbol of the country, you should put the veil. And in both cases, that's not right, because women have the freedom to do whatever they want. So that's why we find in communities in which the veil was sort of banned, people intentionally, or women intentionally challenge that and put the veil. So the veil should not be, it should be an issue of personal freedom. If a woman wants to put the veil, she should be able to. If she doesn't, no one should pressurize her to. And I think it's just, to me, this was a movement of claiming that a woman's body is her body. It's not society's body. It's not, an entity's body. It's not a nation's body, which is something that, looking at from a sociolinguistic perspective, was for a long time the case.
That's very interesting, because I often think that women, they represent a community, while men are authorized to be individuals.
Yes.
And in that sense, I think the woman's struggle is not to be this way or this other way, it's to be yourself.
Exactly.
And that, to me, has a lot to do with, for instance, literature. Yes. Whenever we see a woman writing, we see, okay, she represents womanhood in her writing. And sometimes it does, but sometimes it just represents herself.
I totally agree. And there is a lot of pressure on women to adhere to a specific form of literature, in which she writes an autobiography, in which she writes about women problems, in which she uses symbolism. But again, this has to do with this idea in the culture that women are always used as a symbol. And it's a kind of liberation for a woman writer to be able to move away from all these expectations and write whatever they want to write. As you said, just have the freedom. The same way that you have a freedom over your body, or your ownership over your body and over your thoughts, you should have a freedom over what you really want to write.
Yesterday, when we were having this conversation, you were talking about, for you, the ideal writer will be not knowing what is the gender. And I was just thinking that I'm not sure I read so much women's literature. I read it whenever I do for my courses, but I'm not sure how I choose, how I pick up my writers.
Interesting. Would you be able to tell from the reading whether the gender of the author or not?
That's a very challenging, because I do believe, for instance, there is a couple of writers that could only be women. Clarice Lispector, I don't know if you, Brazilian, Ukrainian, or probably in the 60s. I'm sure only a woman can write like that. I mean, it's very deep, very poetic, very, to me, it goes to the essence of the feminine. And to me, that type of writing could only be a woman, I think. But, for the rest, I don't know. What about you? Would you be able to tell or not?
I think in most cases, yes, I'm able to tell.
Really?
There are some writers that are perfect, whether males or females, but also there are writers that are, unfortunately, women writers that could be very narrow in their perspective. They only speak about themselves, which is fine. I mean, we respect that, but if it's all the novels are only about that, then it's a little bit, could be tiring. For men, I think sometimes the representation of women is, again, very symbolic, very ideal, sketchy. there is no deep feelings. There are no, they don't go in depth about women's achievements and women's ambitions and women's feelings. They would just, sketch a beautiful woman in a novel. And I think that's clear to me. Like sometimes I'm reading a novel and that's, okay, this is written by a man, or I read a novel and this is written by a woman. But in other cases, there are great writers that could express, feelings about both genders without necessarily falling into that trap.
But it's true that I recognize that some of the novels that I read lately, they make me think that those people don't understand.
Yes,
they make the symbology of woman, but
I know.
It's even a little bit offensive. So
it's totally.
But I just recently I pay attention to that. I used before I didn't pay attention to those things, and the more I think about it, the more I consider.
And I feel like we grow up to learn to read better, isn't it? I mean, the more we read, the more we are aware of what we read. Like sometimes the great novels I read at different stages of my life. So I started like 20 and I understood it in a totally different way, 30, totally different way, and then 40, totally different way. So yeah, we sort of read in a different way.
Totally. I think there is very specific other writer woman that I think only a woman could have that vision is one Lady Mary Montagu. I don't know if you ever heard. It was like 18th century, but it was the first one getting into the Ottoman Empire. And the first
yes, I heard about that one.
Hammam.
Yes, I heard about that one. Yeah,
incredible because she has a vision.
That's worth writing about because that's a totally different experience. Yeah.
And the way she writes changed your perspective totally, because she's a woman from the Victorian times, British, goes there and then she sees all these women naked, swimming and having a great time, and they ask her to join, and then she shows her dresses, these Victorian dresses. And then all these Ottoman women thinking, oh, poor European woman, their husbands, they make them into these cages so they cannot move freely. And suddenly that totally changes perspective. A man who could never have written in such a way.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are substantial landmarks in literature written by women and had to be written by women. However, again, usually these are landmarks. We want to make sure that women could write about all themes in the same way that men can. That's also a kind of liberation in a way.
And do you think that is good for education to, let's say, how literature helps education? Is in parallel? Because when I studied, only in the literature class you have to read, and then the rest it was like your own way.
I think literature is essential in all departments, and not because I'm biased, but I personally think in science departments, in business departments, and literature department, humanities, literature is really essential for understanding humans, for being able to communicate. I mean, if you're working in business, you need to communicate. Literature will help you do that. If you are an engineer, you still need to communicate. So literature would help you do that. If you are a humanities major, then you also need literature to be able to understand the depth of human weakness, the depth of human conflict, the depth of human achievement. I think literature is essential in any class, actually. And I think it's important for universities and schools to incorporate literature in all their classes, to be honest. And there will always be a work of literature that is interesting for engineers or interesting for architecture or interesting for business.
I'm thinking now of medicine, for instance, that it is beautiful.
Sure, yes. I mean, medicine, yes, that's another topic in which literature would be essential. But I think it's a pity that sometimes, especially, in a lot of countries now, humanities are not necessarily looked upon in a positive way as much as science, and people are all moving towards studying science, which is fine. But if you end up graduating from university and you have never read a novel, there is something really missing in your life.
And also to integrate both. Perhaps the mistake is to separate humanities from other arts.
Yes.
Probably it's more a complement. What you were saying, I think literature really touches your heart.
I totally agree.
Like a science book is your mind that is at work. But in literature, it's definitely your heart. So you get through an example something that it will be very difficult to explain in words. It's more that a story that it gets to you is more,
Sure.
yeah, probably the emotional part of the science.
And if we are now looking for more tolerance all over the world, we're seeing so much fanaticism everywhere, unfortunately. I personally think that literature could solve that. I think two things could solve it, business and literature. Because in business, you don't look at anything else except your profits. So it doesn't matter what the color, religion, or ethnicity. But with literature, it's the same. Because once you're touched by a human experience, you forget where this person comes from, what is the culture. And that will teach us all tolerance, much more tolerance.
I will add music to that.
Oh, music, of course,
music
yes.
is totally
All kinds of art, I would definitely think. All art would be great.
Literature, perhaps in a translation.
Sure.
I don't know how, because sometimes it helps to overcome prejudice, but perhaps not always, because sometimes...
No, you're right, because it depends what is translated.
Exactly.
Sometimes what is translated is unfortunately... So there is an issue of for literature, especially in the Arab world. Who selects a translation for literature and what is being translated? Is it mainstream work or is it just periphery work? And does it express the real problems of society, or does it just express problems of the few, in society? And I think that's a big issue in translating literature and needs to be re-examined.
Now, that's interesting because it's true. Normally, I know for French translators, you get to know the latest novel and so again, we are again in the branding. Whatever is branded, then is translated, is distributed. So in a way, literature can help overcoming prejudice, but if we are not carefully, they could also be used by some politicians to consolidate some prejudice.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Do you think that could happen?
Yeah, and I think that what survives at the end of literature are the great works that appeal to humanity at large, rather than just a specific, a culture or a specific trauma of one specific person. But if this person's trauma or tragedy is something that we all feel for, then it appeals. Like Shakespeare, for example, we all think about Hamlet. This idea of someone who doesn't know how to take a decision, and we meet someone like this every single day of our life. Someone who's sort of wavering about how to take a decision, and just by wavering for a moment, has a tragedy in their life. And that's exactly because he's appealing to a human being. And I know from my own experience, once I started reading British literature, for example, it's like I knew so much more. It opened horizons for me.
Which one? Because I was thinking when you were talking about literature moving you very deeply. For instance, I think every time I read Jane Eyre, which has absolutely nothing to do with me and my background,
exactly.
I cry every single time I read it.
Yes.
And I have read it, I don't know, 10 times or... What will be your favorite book?
Wuthering Heights for Emily Bronte. Wuthering Heights. This is a novel when I read or tell, I have to cry. There's no way. There is no way. Again, it's written by a woman, and it's written by a woman in 19th century or so, and yet it just appeals to human beings. The feeling of love, loss of love, the passion for someone that you can never be with, and also prejudices in society, and this idea of revenge or the idea of human weakness. She just expresses it in such a wonderful way that you can't but help, you can't help but to really sympathize with all the characters, but also feel bad for all of them.
Totally agree. And also, for my courses, I was reading again and again Virginia Woolf.
Oh yeah, Virginia Woolf is, of course, yeah.
Every time I cry, and I said, how come a Victorian woman that has absolutely nothing to do with me, with different ideas, I probably would not sympathize with her if we talk politics, for instance. But she makes me cry every single time. How can she touch my heart
exactly
in such a way?
I think this is like a very important moment in humanity when we have feelings for people who may not share with us anything except humanity. And that's very important.
So do you think you have such an impact with your books?
I don't know.
I can tell you do.
Thank you so much. It's difficult for me to. I hope this is my ambition in life, but you can never know. Really.
Do you think of anyone in particular when you write?
Not. It depends what I'm writing about. If I'm writing a specific character that really affected me, and I'm writing about the specific character, then of course the character is in my mind.
Yeah, Professor Hannah, it really touched me. I mean, that's the first book.
And Professor Nana is taken from a real person.
Oh, really?
So the little details, about the life of this specific person is taken from this. Perhaps that's also why it appeals to you, because it has honesty in that sense.
It's honest. I mean, you can see the character.
Yes.
It's not a fiction.
Yeah, no, it's a real person.
And also because your latest books are much more about history, about your roots, which I really think is a way literature has like two dimensions, perhaps. One is internal one, exploring yourself, and the other one is communicating something to the public.
And you taught me something about why I started writing historical literature, because it seems like at one stage in our lives we're really trying to look for who we are in terms of historicity, or who are we historically, who are our ancestors. And that is the moment when I suddenly started to write about the Mamluks in Egypt, or medieval Egypt, and try to understand how did we become what we are now, and how would my grandmother, great-great-great-grandmother think about issues. And that was a kind of healing process for me to write about history, for sure.
For me, that was definitely when I was turning 50, I decided to write about my ancestor and also about Spain 100 years ago, try to understand what I was and what I was in relation to my ancestors.
And I like what you said about this is the reconciliation.
Yeah.
With the self and with others, in a way. Yeah.
It was a healing process. I say, okay, I am because they were, and whoever in the future they will be because we are.
I totally agree with that, yes, definitely. I agree with that.
So thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm so glad that we're having this conversation together. We should have more conversations in the future.
Definitely.
Thank you.